Welcome to Work Effectively with People with a Disability. Our first session will focus on myths and stereotypes about people with a disability. As disability support workers and community workers, we need to understand what myths and misconceptions there are about disability in our community. These incorrect assumptions can be triggered by fear of the unknown, a lack of understanding, and personal prejudices against people with disability. Promoting negative images of disability is a form of discrimination because it creates barriers to full participation for people with a disability in their community. So let's look at some common myths and stereotypes. It's important for us to understand what they are so that we're not colluding with them, but rather challenging them so that we're promoting full participation in community. So our first myth is a person's disability defines who they are as a person or individual. Based on the biomedical model, like historically people have been labelled according to their disability or conditions. So it's common in daily life to hear references to people who are disabled, handicapped, deaf, schizophrenic, anorexic. It's really important to not collude with this labeling or pathologizing of people, but rather to separate out the person from their condition. And so it is more appropriate now to refer to people as having a disability or condition. The second myth is people with disabilities are sick and in constant pain. It's really important that we don't collude with this idea because it's likely to pull us into a rescuing or a sympathizing kind of role, whereas we're wanting to empathically respond. People with disabilities typically don't suffer or experience ongoing acute and chronic pain associated with their condition. And of course, that's relying on the disability or disabilities they have. But it's important to understand that pain and feeling unwell is a universal thing that affects us all. The next myth is people with disabilities are brave, courageous, inspirational for having their disability. And so people with disabilities are often portrayed as being superhuman or especially courageous because they're living with some adversity in their life. Covington really challenges this in a really simple but I think eloquent way. He says, we're seen as inspirational and inspiration sells like hotcakes. My disability isn't a burden. Having to be so damned inspirational is. And that leads into the next myth, which is people with disabilities are special and should be treated differently. Well, my experience as a person is that I want to connect around similarities with other people versus differences. And a label of being special does not convey equality. If anything, it can be incredibly patronizing and condescending to refer to someone as being really special for what they're able to do given their disability. It's important to affirm a person's capacity if there are limitations, but there's a fine line in terms of giving very special treatment. And in my experience in supporting clients with a disability, some people will be very offended if they believe that they're getting additional special treatment because they're perceived as being incapable or extremely limited. So something to keep in mind. The next is disability is a personal tragedy and deserves our pity. Disability is often viewed as an unending burden, and people with disabilities are perceived to be tragic figures whom society should pity. Disability doesn't necessarily mean that you'll lead a poor quality of life. If we think of the very famous Stephen Hawking, one of the world's most intelligent human beings, he's had, I think, and I've seen his interviews, he's described himself as having an incredibly fulfilling challenging and purposeful life. So it's important not to assume that a person's life is not worthy of living or lacks meaning because they might be living with a disability. People with disabilities are dependent and always need help. All of us at different stages may need support, whether it's physical or emotional support, and it's important to understand when to ask for support. So people with disabilities on occasion may require support, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be fully dependent on someone else to make all of their decisions and to meet all of their needs. It's always a good strategy not to assume that a person with a disability needs assistance. It's always courteous to ask whether they would like some support. People with disabilities want to associate with each other. So we know that relationships and friendships are a matter of personal choice. People with disabilities may share similar characteristics. However, it shouldn't be assumed that everyone wants to associate or develop friendships with each other, say because they all use a wheelchair or they all have low vision. Just like all people, they have different interests. People are confined to their wheelchair. People with disabilities typically don't view themselves as being confined to a wheelchair in the same way a person without a disability is not described as being confined to their car or their bed at night to sleep. A wheelchair, like any transportation, is a form of mobility that contributes to a person's independence. And another myth is people with disabilities are a one-dimensional group. So there are assumptions made that tend to view people with disabilities as being one-dimensional, who have all the same needs, interests, opinions. People with disabilities reflect the same diversity that exists in the rest of society, including varying social, economic, cultural, family, educational characteristics, different personal interests, personalities, temperaments. The viewpoints expressed by an individual with a disability are not representative of everyone who has a disability. So it's important to treat each person as an individual and to seek to understand them and all their personal idiosyncrasies and interests. And lastly, people with disabilities cannot lead a full and productive life. What we know is people with disabilities are capable of fully participating in community life when they are well supported by their communities and environment. The challenge is to focus on a person's ability, not their limitations. And this is a quote from researchers who did a study at Dawson College. They said, mechanics who are blind, nurses who are wheelchair users, teachers who are hard of hearing, painters without arms, and chemists with shaky limbs, it's all been done. And I guess they're suggesting it's not a big deal. Like, there are people that are incredibly extroverted and fully engaged in their lives. And there's been lots of examples of that recently in the media. So, which has been really lovely because they challenge the very narrow view of people with a disability and their lack of quality of life. So that brings us to the end of this PowerPoint. I hope that you've enjoyed kind of exploring different myths and keeping in mind the importance of having to challenge them so that we can promote full participation in community life for our clients who have a disability. Thanks for listening.